The desert heat shimmered like liquid mercury across the horizon as Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez adjusted her tactical vest for the third time in 10 minutes. The weight distribution still felt wrong, but after 6 months at forward operating Base Crimson, she'd learned that nothing about this place would ever feel quite right. The morning briefing had ended 20 minutes ago, and already she could feel the familiar weight of a dozen pairs of eyes tracking her every movement across the compound. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Elena had spent 8 years proving herself in the United States Army, climbing from private to staff sergeant through a combination of relentless determination and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Her personnel file read like a textbook example of military excellence: expert marksman, advanced combat medic certification, fluent in 3 languages, and a spotless disciplinary record. Yet here at FOB Crimson, none of that seemed to matter as much as the simple fact that she was the only woman in Alpha Company's 3rd platoon. The bet had started 3 weeks ago in the mess tent, whispered loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough for the speakers to maintain plausible deniability. Corporal Jake Morrison, a broad-shouldered farm boy from Iowa with more confidence than sense, had been holding court over his usual breakfast of powdered eggs and bitter coffee. His voice carried that particular brand of casual cruelty that some men mistook for humor. $20 says she breaks down crying before the month's out, Morrison had said, gesturing in Elena's direction with his plastic fork. I mean, come on. This isn't some training exercise back in the States. This is real combat zone stuff. Women just aren't built for this kind of pressure. The comet had drawn nods and low chuckles from his usual circle of supporters. Specialist Danny Chun, a wiry mechanic from California who seemed to worship Morrison despite being older and more experienced, had immediately reached for his wallet. I'll take that bet, but I say 2 weeks max. The first time we take incoming fire, should be crying for her mommy. Private First Class Tyler Brooks, barely 19 and still soft around the edges despite 4 months in country, had looked uncomfortable but hadn't spoken up. His silence had been as loud as agreement in Morrison's eyes, and the bet had quickly grown to include half the platoon. Elena had continued eating her breakfast, her expression carefully neutral, but every word had burned itself into her memory with perfect clarity. The irony wasn't lost on her that these same soldiers had no problem trusting her to treat their wounds when bullets started flying. Elena's medical training was extensive and hard-earned, the result of countless hours of studying trauma protocols and battlefield medicine that went far beyond standard combat medic requirements. She'd volunteered for every advanced course the Army offered, driven by a deep-seated belief that knowledge was the only currency that truly mattered in situations where lives hung in the balance. Lieutenant Marcus Kane, their platoon leader, had inherited Elena when he transferred to FOB Crimson 2 months earlier. At 31, Kane was career military, the son of a Marine colonel who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to a desk job at the Pentagon. Kane's leadership style was professional but distant, the approach of someone who'd learned that emotional detachment was safer than investment in people who might not make it home. He'd made it clear from the beginning that he judged soldiers by their performance, not their demographics, but Elena had noticed that his version of equal treatment often meant holding her to a higher standard than everyone else. The betting pool had grown more elaborate over the weeks, with new categories emerging as Morrison's initial timeline proved overly optimistic. Elena hadn't cried, hadn't asked for special accommodations, hadn't shown any signs of the weakness they seemed so eager to witness. Instead, she'd continued doing her job with the same quiet competence that had carried her through 8 years of military service. She maintained her equipment, completed her patrols, and treated the wounded with a skill that even her harshest critics couldn't question. But competence, Elena had learned wasn't always enough to change minds that were already made up. The betting pool had evolved to include more specific scenarios. Would she cry during her first firefight? Would she freeze up during a medical emergency? Would she request a transfer back to a rear echelon unit where women supposedly belonged? Amounts had grown from $20 to over $300, a significant sum for soldiers earning military pay in a combat zone. Elena's background had prepared her for skepticism, but not quite at this level of systematic doubt. She'd grown up in a family where military service was both expected and respected. Her father had been a career Navy Chief Petty Officer, her mother a Marine Corps logistics specialist who'd met her husband during a joint training exercise in North Carolina. Elena had literally grown up on military bases, absorbing the culture and values of service members who measured worth by dedication and results rather than superficial characteristics. Her decision to enlist immediately after high school had surprised no one in her family, but her choice to pursue combat-related specialties had raised eyebrows even among people who should have known better. The combination of infantry training and advanced medical certification was unusual for anyone, but particularly for a woman in an era when combat roles were just beginning to open up. Elena had navigated the bureaucracy and skepticism with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else, treating each obstacle as a problem to be solved rather than a barrier to be accepted. The deployment to Afghanistan had been her first time in an active combat zone, but Elena had prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything else, through exhaustive study and mental rehearsal of every possible scenario. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd read after-action reports from previous deployments, studied the tactical situation in their area of operations, and memorized the medical protocols for treating everything from gunshot wounds to improvised explosive device injuries. Knowledge was armor, and Elena believed in wearing as much as possible. FOB Crimson itself was a study in controlled chaos, a collection of prefabricated buildings and defensive barriers carved out of the Afghan landscape like a temporary scar on an ancient land. The base housed roughly 400 soldiers from various units, but Alpha Company's 3rd Platoon operated with a high degree of independence, conducting patrols and security operations in a sector that had seen increasing insurgent activity over the past several months. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring soldiers who could think quickly and adapt to rapidly changing situations. Elena's position as the platoon's senior medic meant she was simultaneously essential and isolated. When soldiers were wounded, her gender became irrelevant in the face of her ability to save lives. But during the long stretches between medical emergencies, she often found herself occupying a strange middle ground between acceptance and rejection. She was too valuable to be openly ostracized, but too different to be fully included in the casual camaraderie that bound her male colleagues together. The morning briefing had covered routine patrol schedules and intelligence updates about insurgent activity in their sector. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the day would be anything other than another exercise in vigilant boredom, punctuated by moments of stark terror. Elena had taken notes with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, but part of her mind had been occupied with the logistics of the medical supplies inventory she needed to complete before lunch. Maintaining adequate medical supplies in a forward operating base required constant attention to detail and creative problem solving. The supply chain from rear echelon units was reliable but slow, and Elena had learned to anticipate needs weeks in advance. Running out of critical supplies during a medical emergency wasn't just a bureaucratic failure. It was a potential death sentence for wounded soldiers who depended on her expertise in preparation. The betting pool's latest evolution had focused on a scenario that both amused and insulted Elena in equal measure. Morrison had proposed a new category, Would she be able to carry a wounded soldier to safety under fire? The implicit assumption was that her smaller stature, at 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds, made her physically incapable of the kind of heroic rescue that defined military legend. The bet had drawn enthusiastic participation from soldiers who seemed to view her physical capabilities as inherently limited by her gender. Elena had said nothing about the fact that she could deadlift twice her body weight, that her endurance scores consistently ranked in the top 10% of all soldiers regardless of gender, or that she'd spent years developing the kind of functional strength that mattered more than impressive numbers on a gym equipment. She'd learned that demonstrations were more convincing than explanations, and that some lessons could only be taught through experience rather than words. The irony of the betting pool was that it had actually motivated Elena to push herself even harder. Every morning before dawn, she completed a workout routine that would have challenged soldiers twice her size. Every evening after duty hours, she practiced combat scenarios and medical procedures until muscle memory took over from conscious thought. The skepticism of her colleagues had become fuel for a level of preparation that bordered on obsessive, but Elena had never been interested in doing things halfway. Her personal equipment reflected the same attention to detail that characterized everything else about her approach to military service. Her medical kit was organized with surgical precision, every item placed exactly where it could be accessed quickly under stress. Her weapon was maintained to a standard that impressed even the platoon's most demanding sergeants. Her uniforms were pressed and fitted properly, because Elena had learned that appearing professional was the first step toward being treated professionally. The relationship between Elena and Lieutenant Kane remained complicated by mutual respect and unspoken tension. Kane's evaluation reports consistently praised her performance, but Elena sensed that he viewed her as a potential liability despite her demonstrated competence. The pressure of command in a combat zone was enormous, and Elena understood that Kane's primary concern was keeping his soldiers alive and completing their mission successfully. Her presence added a variable that he hadn't trained for and wasn't entirely comfortable managing. The enlisted soldiers' attitudes varied widely, from Morrison's open hostility to Brooks's uncomfortable neutrality to a few soldiers who seemed genuinely indifferent to her gender. Sergeant First Class David Williams, the platoon sergeant, had worked with Elena long enough to trust her abilities, but even his support felt conditional on her continued performance at an exceptional level. There was no room for normal human mistakes or temporary lapses in judgment, because any failure would be attributed to her gender rather than her individual shortcomings. The betting pool had created an atmosphere where Elena's every action was scrutinized for signs of weakness or incompetence. A hesitation during a patrol became evidence of fear. A request for clarification during a briefing became proof of confusion. A moment of visible fatigue after a long day became confirmation that women weren't suited for combat operations. Elena had learned to maintain perfect composure at all times, because any display of normal human emotion would be weaponized against her and, by extension, against all women who might follow in her footsteps. The weight of representation was something Elena carried alongside her medical kit and weapon, a constant reminder that she wasn't just fighting for her own acceptance, but for the future opportunities of women who would come after her. Every successful mission strengthened the argument for female inclusion in combat roles. Every mistake would be used to justify exclusion and discrimination. The pressure was enormous and unrelenting, but Elena had accepted it as part of the price of being a pioneer in a field that had traditionally excluded her gender. The morning's patrol assignment had been routine, a security sweep through the village of Kanabad, about 6 miles southeast of the base. Intelligence reports suggested increased insurgent activity in the area, but nothing that required special precautions beyond standard security protocols. Elena had packed her medical kit with extra supplies, not because she expected trouble, but because preparation had become second nature. after months of experience in unpredictable environments. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, 2 armored Humvees and 1 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle that served as both transport and mobile command post. Elena rode in the second Humvee alongside Corporal Morrison, Specialist Chun, and Private Brooks, a seating arrangement that felt deliberately designed to test her composure under the constant pressure of their skepticism. The 40-minute drive to Kanabad passed in relative silence, broken only by radio check-ins and the occasional comment about the landscape or weather conditions. Elena used the travel time to review her mental inventory of medical supplies and treatment protocols, a habit that had served her well during previous missions. She carried enough equipment to handle multiple casualties, including surgical airways, chest decompression needles, and a substantial supply of hemostatic agents designed to control severe bleeding. Her medical training had emphasized the importance of being prepared for worst-case scenarios, because combat medicine rarely provided second chances for inadequate preparation. The village of Kanabad represented a microcosm of the challenges facing coalition forces throughout Afghanistan. The population was simultaneously grateful for security assistance and resentful of foreign military presence, a contradiction that created an atmosphere of constant tension and uncertainty. Elena had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated local sentiment, the number of children visible on the streets, the willingness of adults to make eye contact with passing soldiers, the presence or absence of normal commercial activity in the market areas. Lieutenant Kane's briefing had emphasized the importance of building positive relationships with local residents while maintaining appropriate security precautions. The mission parameters were straightforward: conduct a presence patrol through the main commercial district, interact with local leaders if possible, and gather intelligence about recent insurgent activity. Nothing in the briefing had suggested anything more dangerous than the routine risks associated with any patrol in a contested area. Elena's role during patrols extended beyond medical support to include basic intelligence gathering and cultural liaison duties. Her language skills, while not perfect, were sufficient for simple conversations with local residents, and her presence sometimes made women and children more willing to approach the patrol with information or requests for assistance. She'd learned that effective counterinsurgency operations required building trust with the entire population, not just adult males who dominated traditional power structures. The patrol's arrival in Kanabad followed standard protocols established through months of similar operations. The vehicles parked in a defensive formation that provided maximum visibility and fields of fire, while allowing rapid departure if circumstances required. Elena disembarked with her medical kit and rifle, automatically scanning the surrounding area for potential threats, while remaining approachable to any civilians who might need medical attention. The morning proceeded exactly as dozens of previous patrols had proceeded, with soldiers moving through predetermined routes while maintaining communication with local residents and observing conditions that might indicate insurgent presence or activity. Elena treated a child's infected cut, helped distribute school supplies that had been donated by a charity organization back in the United States, and assisted with translating conversations between soldiers and village elders. The work was routine, but important, part of the broader effort to establish stability and security in a region that had known decades of conflict. Morrison's attitude during the patrol reflected the same casual hostility that characterized his behavior back at the base, but within the bounds of military discipline and professional requirements. He completed his assigned tasks competently while making occasional comments designed to undermine Elena's confidence or authority. Chun and Brooks followed Morrison's lead, creating an atmosphere of subtle harassment that fell just short of actionable misconduct but made Elena's job more difficult than it needed to be. The first indication that something was wrong came from Specialist Rodriguez, who was monitoring radio communications from the lead vehicle. Intelligence reports were coming in about a convoy that had been attacked approximately 10 miles to the north, with casualties and requests for medical evacuation. The attack had occurred along a route that Elena's patrol had used just 2 days earlier, a reminder that safety was always temporary and conditional in a combat environment. Lieutenant Kane made the decision to extend their patrol by an additional hour, partly to avoid returning to base along predictable routes, and partly to gather additional intelligence about potential insurgent movement in their area of operations. Elena approved of the decision from a tactical standpoint, but she also recognized that extended operations increased the likelihood of contact with hostile forces. She checked her medical supplies again and confirmed radio frequencies for medical evacuation requests, standard preparations that had become automatic responses to changing circumstances. The market area of Khanabad was unusually quiet for mid-morning, a detail that Elena noted with growing concern. During previous patrols, the commercial district had been bustling with activity by this time of day, filled with vendors selling everything from fresh produce to household goods. Today, many of the shops remained closed, and the few people visible on the streets moved with the purposeful haste of individuals who wanted to complete their business and return to the safety of their homes. Elena's observations about civilian behavior patterns had proven accurate during previous deployments, and she'd learned to trust her instincts about situations that felt wrong, even when she couldn't identify specific threat indicators. The absence of normal activity suggested that local residents had received advance warning about potential violence, either through insurgent networks or through the kind of informal communication systems that allowed information to spread rapidly through small communities. The patrol's movement through the market area proceeded according to established procedures, with soldiers maintaining appropriate spacing and fields of fire while engaging with any civilians who seemed willing to communicate. Elena positioned herself where she could respond quickly to either medical emergencies or requests for information from local residents, particularly women who might be reluctant to approach male soldiers with questions or concerns about family members. The explosion, when it came, originated from a compound approximately 200 meters to the east of the patrol's position. Elena's first thought was that it sounded like a controlled detonation, possibly an improvised explosive device being assembled or tested by insurgent forces. Her second thought, based on the secondary explosions that followed the initial blast, was that something had gone seriously wrong with whatever the insurgents had been attempting to accomplish. Lieutenant Kane's immediate response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that had earned him his position as platoon leader. Instead of rushing toward the explosion site, he ordered the patrol to establish a defensive perimeter while gathering information about what had actually occurred. The decision proved wise when radio communications revealed that the explosion had been accidental, the result of insurgent forces mishandling explosive materials while preparing for an attack on a different target. The tactical situation changed rapidly as information continued to flow through radio networks and local sources. The accidental explosion had killed or wounded several insurgent fighters, but it had also triggered a larger engagement between remaining insurgent forces and an Afghan National Army unit that had been patrolling in the same general area. Elena's patrol found itself positioned between two separate firefights, neither of which they had initiated, but both of which posed significant risks to their safe return to base. Elena's medical training included extensive instruction in combat casualty care, but the scenarios she'd studied and practiced had assumed that wounded soldiers would be members of her own unit rather than potential enemies who might pose ongoing security threats. The ethical obligations of medical personnel to treat all wounded individuals, regardless of their combatant status, created complicated decisions when those same individuals might resume hostile activities once they recovered from their injuries. The radio call that changed everything came at 11:47 a.m., exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes after the patrol had departed FOB Crimson for what was supposed to be a routine security sweep. Lieutenant Kane's voice carried the controlled urgency that Elena had learned to associate with rapidly developing tactical situations that required immediate response from all patrol members. Afghan National Army Unit requests immediate medical assistance. Multiple casualties from the compound explosion. Grid coordinates follow. Kane's subsequent transmission included precise location information and initial casualty reports. At least 6 wounded Afghan soldiers, with injuries ranging from burns and shrapnel wounds to potential amputations and traumatic brain injuries. The medical requirements exceeded anything that could be handled by basic first aid or the limited medical supplies that Afghan forces typically carried during patrol operations. Elena's immediate response was to inventory her medical supplies and calculate the time required to reach the casualty site while maintaining appropriate security precautions. Her kit contained enough equipment to handle multiple trauma patients, but the nature and severity of the reported injuries would strain her capabilities and require careful triage decisions about which patients received priority treatment. Tactical situation was complicated by the ongoing presence of insurgent forces in the area, making medical evacuation extremely difficult until the security situation could be stabilized. The debate that followed Kane's announcement revealed the deep divisions within the patrol about Elena's capabilities and the wisdom of exposing their medic to additional risks. Morrison's immediate response was to suggest that Elena remain with the vehicles while other soldiers provided basic first aid to the wounded Afghan forces. His argument, presented with the kind of superficial logic that made it difficult to challenge directly, was that Elena's medical skills were too valuable to risk in a potentially compromised tactical environment. Chun's support for Morrison's position focused on Elena's physical capabilities rather than her medical expertise. His argument was that the casualty site was located in difficult terrain that would require significant physical exertion to reach, and that Elena's smaller stature made her unsuitable for the kind of rescue operations that might be required. The implication was that male soldiers would be better equipped to handle both the physical demands and the security risks associated with providing medical assistance in a combat environment. Brooks remained silent during the discussion, his discomfort with the situation obvious, but his unwillingness to challenge Morrison's authority equally apparent. Elena recognized the position Brooks found himself in, caught between his instinctive sense that Morrison was wrong and his social need to maintain standing within the group. The dynamics were familiar from countless similar situations throughout her military career, moments when doing the right thing required social courage that not everyone possessed. Elena's response to the debate was characteristically direct and focused on mission requirements rather than personal feelings or interpersonal dynamics. She pointed out that her medical training was specifically designed for exactly this type of situation, that her equipment was organized for rapid trauma response, and that delaying medical treatment for seriously wounded soldiers was likely to result in preventable deaths. Her argument was clinical and professional, designed to appeal to military logic rather than emotional considerations. Lieutenant Kane's decision to approve Elena's participation in the medical response mission reflected both his recognition of her capabilities and his understanding of the tactical situation's requirements. The wounded Afghan soldiers needed immediate medical attention that exceeded the capabilities of standard first aid training, and Elena was the only person in the patrol with the necessary expertise and equipment. The decision was tactically sound, but Kane's visible reluctance suggested that he shared some of his soldiers' concerns about exposing their medic to additional risks. The movement to the casualty site required a forced march across approximately 800 meters of challenging terrain that included rocky outcroppings, irrigation ditches, and scattered vegetation that provided concealment for potential insurgent forces. Elena's physical conditioning allowed her to maintain the pace set by the lead elements while carrying her full medical kit and personal weapon. Despite the additional weight, the that brought her total load to nearly 80 pounds. The scene that greeted Elena at the casualty site exceeded even her worst-case mental preparations for mass casualty situations. The explosion had occurred inside a fortified compound that insurgent forces had been using as a weapons cache and assembly area, and the secondary detonations had created a level of destruction that made it difficult to distinguish between building materials and human remains. 6 Afghan soldiers lay scattered across an area roughly 30 meters square, their injuries reflecting the chaotic nature of the blast effects and debris patterns. Elena's initial triage assessment revealed 3 soldiers with critical injuries. That required immediate intervention, 2 with serious but stable conditions that could wait for evacuation, and 1 who had been killed instantly by the explosion. The critical cases included a soldier with severe burns, covering approximately 60% of his body, another with a traumatic amputation of his left leg below the knee, and a third with obvious signs of traumatic brain injury and possible internal bleeding. The tactical situation remained fluid and dangerous, with sporadic gunfire audible from multiple directions and radio reports, indicating that insurgent forces were attempting to maneuver into positions that would allow them to engage the medical response team. Elena began her treatment protocols while other members of the patrol established a defensive perimeter and coordinated with higher headquarters for medical evacuation support. The work required total concentration despite the ongoing security threats and the knowledge that their position could be compromised at any moment. Elena's treatment of the burn victim required immediate action to prevent shock and fluid loss, while managing pain and preventing infection. Her medical kit included specialized burn dressings and intravenous fluids, but the severity of the injuries exceeded what could be definitively treated in a field environment. She established 4-access, administered pain medication, and covered the worst burns with sterile dressings, while providing psychological support to a soldier who was conscious and aware of the extent of his injuries. The soldier with the traumatic amputation presented different challenges that required Elena to apply tourniquets, control bleeding, and prevent shock while preparing the wounded limb for possible surgical reattachment, if medical evacuation could be arranged quickly enough. Her training had included extensive instruction in hemorrhage control and trauma surgery, but the practical application under combat conditions required improvisation and adaptation that pushed her skills to their absolute limits. The head injury case was simultaneously the most critical and the most difficult to treat effectively in a field environment. Elena's assessment revealed signs of increased intracranial pressure that could be immediately life-threatening, but the definitive treatment required surgical intervention that was only available at a major medical facility. She focused on maintaining airway patency, monitoring vital signs, and preventing secondary injury while preparing the patient for what would likely be a lengthy and dangerous medical evacuation. The radio call that changed Elena's status from medic to hero came at 12:23 p.m., 36 minutes after she had begun treating the wounded Afghan soldiers. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces had identified the medical response team's location and were moving to engage them with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The security situation had deteriorated to the point where immediate evacuation was required, but the wounded soldiers could not be moved without risking fatal complications from their injuries. Lieutenant Kane's voice carried the strain of a leader facing impossible choices when he announced that the patrol needed to withdraw immediately to avoid being overrun by superior insurgent forces. The tactical situation left no room for extended medical treatment or careful patient transport procedures. Elena would have to choose between abandoning her patients or remaining behind to continue treatment while the rest of the patrol withdrew to defensible positions. Elena's response to Kane's announcement was immediate and unequivocal. She would remain with the wounded soldiers and continue treatment regardless of the tactical situation. Her decision was based partly on medical ethics that prohibited abandoning patients who required ongoing care, but also on a tactical assessment that the wounded soldiers would certainly die. If left alone, while they might survive if she could continue treatment until proper evacuation assets arrived. Morrison's reaction to Elena's decision revealed the extent to which his skepticism about her capabilities had been replaced by genuine concern for her safety and the mission's success. His immediate proposal was for the entire patrol to remain in place and defend the casualty site until evacuation could be arranged, a suggestion that demonstrated tactical thinking but ignored the reality of their limited ammunition and the insurgent forces' numerical advantage. The compromise solution emerged from Elena's own tactical analysis of the situation and her understanding of both medical requirements and security limitations. She proposed that she would remain with the 3 critical patients, while the rest of the patrol withdrew to an overwatch position approximately 200 meters away, where they could provide supporting fire and coordinate evacuation assets without exposing the entire unit to unnecessary risk. Kane's acceptance of Elena's proposal reflected both his recognition of her tactical competence and his understanding that alternative solutions would likely result in multiple deaths rather than saving lives. The decision was militarily sound, but personally difficult, requiring him to leave one of his soldiers in an extremely dangerous situation based on her professional judgment and tactical assessment. The weight of command had never felt heavier than in the moment when he approved Elena's plan. The withdrawal of the patrol's main body left Elena alone with 3 critically wounded Afghan soldiers in a tactical environment that was rapidly becoming untenable. Insurgent forces were moving closer to her position, using buildings and terrain features to mask their approach while maintaining suppressive fire that made movement extremely dangerous. Elena's situation had evolved from challenging to desperate, but her focus remained entirely on the medical requirements of her patients. The next 47 minutes would test every aspect of Elena's training, physical conditioning, and mental preparation in ways that no simulation or training exercise could duplicate. She continued treating the wounded soldiers while monitoring radio communications and preparing for the possibility that she might need to move them to safety using nothing but her own physical capabilities and tactical knowledge. The betting pool that had started as casual mockery of her supposed weaknesses was about to be definitively settled. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the rubble 20 meters to Elena's left, sending chunks of concrete and twisted metal, fragments whistling through the air with lethal velocity. The explosion's concussion wave pressed against her eardrums like invisible hands, but she forced herself to maintain steady pressure on the makeshift bandage she'd fashioned around Sergeant Ahmad's severed leg. Blood continued seeping through the layers of gauze despite the tourniquet she'd applied 15 minutes earlier, and his pulse was becoming increasingly thready as shock threatened to claim him before any insurgent bullet could. Elena's tactical radio crackled with Lieutenant Kane's voice, strained but controlled as he attempted to coordinate supporting fire from the patrol's overwatch position. Crimson 7, this is Crimson 6. Insurgent forces approaching from the northeast. Count approximately 12 fighters with small arms and RPGs. We're engaging targets of opportunity, but they're using the compound walls for cover. The burned soldier, who'd introduced himself as Captain Rashid before lapsing into semi-consciousness, stirred restlessly as Elena checked his intravenous fluid levels. The saline solution was running low, and she'd already used most of her emergency burn medications to manage his pain and prevent infection. His breathing remained labored, complicated by smoke inhalation that threatened to compromise his airway completely. Elena made a mental note to prepare an emergency cricothyrotomy if his condition deteriorated further. The soldier with the head injury presented the most complex challenge from a medical standpoint. Corporal Nasir showed signs of increasing intracranial pressure that manifested in dilated pupils, irregular breathing patterns, and periodic episodes of projectile vomiting that threatened to block his airway. Elena had positioned him on his side to prevent aspiration, but proper treatment required surgical intervention that was impossible under current circumstances. She could only monitor his condition and hope that evacuation arrived before irreversible brain damage occurred. Another explosion, closer this time, showered Elena's position with debris. That included fragments of brick and concrete mixed with what appeared to be pieces of wooden furniture. The insurgent forces were systematically destroying potential cover while advancing toward her position, using a combination of direct fire and explosive devices to eliminate any defensive advantages the terrain might have provided. Elena pressed herself lower against the ground while maintaining contact with her patients, acutely aware that any movement above the level of the scattered rubble would draw immediate gunfire. Elena's radio buzzed with an incoming transmission from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who was monitoring communications from the main patrol's position. Crimson 7, medical evacuation is inbound, but estimate 25 minutes to arrival. Situation report on patient status and your defensive position. Elena keyed her radio while continuing to apply pressure to Sergeant Ahmad's wound, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her position. 3 critical patients, all stable for now but requiring immediate surgical intervention. My position is compromised but defensible for short periods. Ammunition count is 60 rounds for my primary weapon, plus 3 fragmentation grenades. The response came from Lieutenant Kane, whose tone carried the weight of a commander making decisions with incomplete information and unacceptable alternatives. Crimson 7 were working on extraction options, but insurgent forces have positioned themselves between your location and any safe withdrawal route. Continue patient care and prepare for possible movement on my command. Elena understood the implications of Kane's message without requiring further explanation. The insurgent forces had executed a tactical maneuver that effectively trapped her with the wounded soldiers in a position that was becoming less defensible with each passing minute. Movement would risk fatal complications for her patients, but remaining stationary would eventually result in being overrun by superior numbers of enemy fighters. The tactical situation deteriorated further when automatic weapons fire began impacting the walls and rubble piles surrounding Elena's position. The distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles mixed with the heavier reports of machine gun fire, indicating that the insurgent forces had brought crew-served weapons to bear on her location. Elena calculated angles and distances while treating her patients, recognizing that the enemy fighters were attempting to suppress her position while maneuvering for a final assault. Captain Rashid regained consciousness as Elena was adjusting his burn dressings, his eyes focusing on her face with the kind of clarity that sometimes preceded either recovery or death in severely wounded patients. His voice was barely audible above the sound of incoming fire, but his words carried the formal precision of a professional soldier addressing a respected colleague. American medic, you should leave us and save yourself. We are grateful for your care, but our wounds are not worth your life. Rashid's English was accented but clear, the result of years working alongside coalition forces in various capacities. Elena noted that his vital signs remained stable despite the severity of his burns, suggesting a level of physical resilience that might allow him to survive if proper medical evacuation could be arranged. Elena's response to Rashid's suggestion was immediate and uncompromising, delivered while she continued monitoring Corporal Nasir's neurological status. Captain, I'm not leaving anyone behind. My job is to keep you alive until we can get you to a proper medical facility, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar fire, a sound that Elena had learned to interpret during countless training exercises, but had never experienced in actual combat conditions. She threw herself across her patients, using her own body to shield them from the blast effects and debris that erupted from the mortar round's impact approximately 30 meters away. The explosion left her ears ringing and her uniform covered with dust and small fragments, but her patients remained protected. Elena's radio crackled with urgent transmissions as the tactical situation continued evolving in directions that nobody had anticipated. Intelligence reports indicated that additional insurgent forces were moving toward the area, attracted by the sounds of combat and the opportunity to engage isolated coalition forces. The local tactical situation was becoming part of a larger engagement that threatened to overwhelm the limited resources available for medical evacuation and security support. The realization that she might need to move her patients to safety using only her own physical capabilities forced Elena to conduct a rapid assessment of each soldier's condition and transportability. Sergeant Ahmad's tourniqueted leg made him relatively stable for movement, but his weight exceeded Elena's carrying capacity by at least 40 pounds. Captain Rashid's burns required careful handling to prevent additional tissue damage, but his consciousness level made him capable of limited self-assistance during movement. Corporal Nasir's head injury made any movement extremely dangerous, but leaving him behind would certainly result in his death. Elena's tactical radio buzzed with Morrison's voice, carrying an unusual tone of respect mixed with genuine concern for her safety. Crimson 7. This is Crimson 3. We've identified a possible withdrawal route through the irrigation ditch system approximately 50 meters south of your position. Insurgent forces haven't occupied that sector yet, but you'd need to move fast. The proposed withdrawal route represented both opportunity and enormous risk, requiring Elena to transport 3 critically wounded soldiers across difficult terrain while under enemy observation and fire. The irrigation ditches provided concealment, but were filled with water and mud that would complicate movement and potentially contaminate her patient's wounds. Elena calculated distances, time requirements, and physical demands while continuing to monitor her patient's medical status. Lieutenant Kane's voice cut through the radio, chatter with the decisive tone that Elena had learned to associate with orders that were not subject to discussion or modification. Crimson 7, prepare for immediate extraction. We're going to lay down suppressive fire and create a smoke screen to mask your movement. You'll have approximately 3 minutes of concealment to reach the withdrawal route. Elena's immediate response focused on the medical logistics of moving 3 critically wounded patients under combat conditions. Crimson 6, I need to stabilize patients for movement. Estimate 2 minutes to secure equipment and prepare for transport. Advise when you're ready to initiate covering fire. The next 2 minutes required Elena to make a series of rapid decisions that would determine whether her patient survived the evacuation attempt. She secured Sergeant Ahmad's tourniquet with additional wrapping to prevent loosening during movement, adjusted Captain Rashid's intravenous line to prevent disconnection, and positioned Corporal Nasir to minimize movement of his injured head and neck. Each action was performed with the mechanical precision of someone whose training had become so deeply ingrained that conscious thought was no longer required. Elena's preparation for the evacuation included redistributing her medical supplies to ensure that critical medications and equipment remained accessible during movement. She transferred the most essential items to her tactical vest, while securing larger pieces of equipment to prevent loss during what would certainly be a chaotic withdrawal under fire. The weight distribution was far from optimal, but combat medicine rarely provided ideal conditions for any procedure or operation. The smoke grenades detonated with hollow pops that Elena felt as much as heard, releasing thick white clouds that began drifting across the casualty site within seconds. The concealment was temporary and complete, but it provided enough visual obstruction to mask movement from insurgent observation posts, while Kane's patrol delivered suppressive fire against known and suspected enemy positions. Elena's first movement was to Sergeant Ahmed, whose weight and injury required the most careful handling during transport. She positioned herself to lift him in a fireman's carry, distributing his weight across her shoulders and back while maintaining pressure on his wounded leg. The technique was one she'd practiced countless times during training, but never while wearing full combat equipment and carrying additional medical supplies. The physical demands of carrying a wounded soldier exceeded anything Elena had experienced during even her most challenging training exercises. Ahmad's weight, combined with her own equipment and the uneven terrain, created a level of exertion that pushed her cardiovascular system to its absolute limits. Her breathing became labored within the first 50 meters, but she maintained steady progress toward the irrigation ditch, while automatic weapons fire snapped overhead. Elena's arrival at the concealment of the irrigation ditch provided temporary relief from direct enemy observation, but the tactical situation remained desperate. She had successfully moved one patient to relative safety, but 2 others remained at the original casualty site where insurgent forces were advancing with increasing boldness. The smoke screen was beginning to dissipate, and her window of opportunity for additional evacuations was rapidly closing. The return trip to retrieve Captain Rashid required Elena to navigate the same dangerous ground while insurgent forces adjusted their fire to compensate for the diminishing smoke concealment. Bullets impacted the earth around her feet with sharp cracks that indicated extremely close misses, but Elena maintained her movement discipline and reached Rashid's position without sustaining injury. His condition remained stable, but the stress of the tactical situation was clearly affecting his vital signs. Captain Rashid's evacuation presented different challenges from Ahmad's transport, primarily because his burn injuries required careful handling to prevent additional tissue damage. Elena adapted her carrying technique to distribute pressure away from the most severely burned areas while maintaining the speed necessary to cross the danger area before the smoke screen completely dissipated. Rashid remained conscious throughout the movement, offering what assistance he could while fighting the effects of pain medication and physiological shock. The second successful evacuation left Elena with 1 patient remaining at the original casualty site, but Corporal Nasir's head injury made him the most dangerous to move and the most likely to suffer fatal complications from transport trauma. Elena's medical training emphasized that head injury patients required careful stabilization and gentle handling, conditions that were impossible to maintain during a combat evacuation under direct enemy fire. Elena's tactical radio crackled with urgent transmissions as the insurgent forces launched what appeared to be a coordinated assault on the casualty site. Lieutenant Kane's voice carried the strain of a commander, watching his medic attempt an evacuation that was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing minute. Crimson 7, insurgent forces are massing for a final push. You need to extract immediately or risk being overrun. The decision to attempt Nasir's evacuation, despite the medical risks, was based on Elena's assessment that leaving him behind would certainly result in his death, while movement offered at least some possibility of survival. She prepared him for transport by securing his head and neck as much as possible, knowing that any movement could potentially cause irreversible spinal cord damage or worsen his brain injury. Elena's final evacuation required her to carry Corporal Nasir while the smokescreen had completely dissipated and insurgent forces were advancing within direct visual range of the casualty site. Automatic weapons fire intensified as enemy fighters attempted to prevent her escape, but Kane's patrol responded with accurate suppressive fire that forced the insurgents to seek cover rather than maintaining aimed fire at Elena's position. The weight of carrying 3 wounded soldiers in succession had pushed Elena's physical capabilities beyond normal endurance limits, but adrenaline and determination sustained her through what should have been an impossible physical feat. Her legs trembled with fatigue, her breathing came in ragged gasps, and her vision blurred from exhaustion, but she maintained steady progress toward the irrigation ditch, where Ahmad and Rashid waited for medical evacuation. Elena's arrival at the irrigation ditch with all 3 patients marked the successful completion of an evacuation that military analysts would later describe as one of the most remarkable combat rescues of the entire Afghan campaign. She had transported 3 critically wounded soldiers across 800 meters of contested terrain while under direct enemy fire, using nothing but her own physical strength and tactical knowledge to accomplish what conventional wisdom suggested was impossible. The medical evacuation helicopter's arrival 23 minutes later provided Elena with her first opportunity to conduct proper triage and treatment in a relatively secure environment. Ahmad's tourniqueted leg had remained stable during transport. Rashid's burns showed no signs of additional trauma from movement, and Nasir's neurological status appeared unchanged despite the unavoidable jostling during evacuation. All 3 patients remained viable candidates for advanced medical treatment. Elena's condition after the evacuation revealed the physical toll of her extraordinary effort. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and stained with her patient's blood. Her hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline, and her voice was hoarse from exertion and stress. Medical personnel aboard the evacuation helicopter noted that her vital signs indicated severe dehydration and physical exhaustion that bordered on collapse, but she refused treatment until her patients had been stabilized for transport. The helicopter evacuation to the Role 3 medical facility at Bagram Airfield provided Elena with her first opportunity to decompress from the intensity of the past 3 hours. As the aircraft lifted off from the landing zone, she could see the tactical situation below resolving as additional coalition forces arrived to secure the area and pursue the insurgent forces that had initiated the engagement. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications of her performance would resonate far beyond the tactical situation in Khanabad. Elena's after-action report, filed 18 hours later after a mandatory rest period, provided a clinical account of the medical procedures and tactical decisions that had resulted in the successful evacuation of 3 critically wounded soldiers. Her writing was characteristically precise and factual, focusing on lessons learned and recommendations for future operations, rather than personal reflection or emotional processing of the events. The intelligence debriefing that followed Elena's medical evacuation revealed that insurgent forces had been planning a complex ambush targeting coalition patrols in the Khanabad area, using the weapon's cache explosion as bait to draw forces into a prepared killing zone. Elena's patrol had inadvertently disrupted the operation by responding to the Afghan casualties, but their presence had also made them targets for an enemy force that significantly outnumbered and outgunned them. Lieutenant Kane's formal commendation of Elena's performance during the Khanabad engagement emphasized both her medical competence and her tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. His report noted that her actions had directly saved 3 lives while maintaining the tactical integrity of the patrol and preventing a medical emergency from becoming a catastrophic defeat. The language was formal and military, but Kane's personal respect for Elena's performance was evident in every carefully chosen word. The reaction of Elena's fellow soldiers to her performance during the Khanabad engagement revealed the extent to which their attitudes had been transformed by witnessing her capabilities under actual combat conditions. Morrison's public acknowledgement that he had been wrong about Elena's abilities carried particular weight because of his previous role as the primary skeptic regarding her suitability for combat operations. His admission that the betting pool had been based on prejudice rather than evidence marked a significant shift in the platoon's dynamic. Specialist Chun's response to Elena's combat performance focused on the physical aspects of her evacuation, acknowledging that her strength and endurance had exceeded anything he had believed possible for someone of her size and gender. His previous assumptions about physical limitations had been conclusively disproven by Elena's ability to carry 3 wounded soldiers to safety under conditions that would have challenged soldiers twice her size. Private Brooks found his voice in the aftermath of the Khanabad engagement, expressing both admiration for Elena's courage and regret for his failure to challenge the betting pool when it began. His evolution from silent complicity to active support represented the kind of moral growth that combat sometimes catalyzed in young soldiers, who were forced to confront the difference between their assumptions and reality. The broader implications of Elena's performance extended beyond her immediate unit to influence policies and attitudes throughout the theater of operations. Her successful evacuation under combat conditions provided concrete evidence that female soldiers could perform at the highest levels in the most demanding circumstances, supporting arguments for expanded opportunities and integration in combat roles. Elena's personal processing of the combat engagement revealed a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and emotional exhaustion that was typical of soldiers who had performed exceptionally under extreme stress. She took pride in her medical competence and tactical decision-making, but the weight of responsibility for 3 lives and the physical demands of the evacuation had pushed her to the absolute limits of her capabilities. The medical follow-up on Elena's 3 patients provided validation for her treatment decisions and evacuation procedures. Sergeant Ahmad's leg was successfully reattached through microsurgery. Captain Rashid's burns healed with minimal scarring thanks to immediate treatment. And Corporal Nasir made a complete recovery from his head injury with no permanent neurological deficits. Elena's medical interventions and transport decisions had quite literally saved 3 lives. The transformation of the betting pool from mockery to respect represented a broader shift in attitudes that extended throughout FOB Crimson and beyond. Elena's performance had not just disproven specific assumptions about her capabilities, but had challenged fundamental beliefs about gender roles and physical limitations that had shaped military culture for generations. The change was gradual, but unmistakable, as soldiers who had witnessed her performance shared their experiences with others. Elena's return to regular duty status 3 days after the combat engagement was marked by a subtle but significant change in how she was treated by both superiors and peers. The casual skepticism that had characterized her early months at FOB Crimson was replaced by professional respect based on demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances. She had earned her place through performance rather than policy in a way that no regulation or directive could have accomplished. The lessons learned from Elena's performance during the combat engagement influenced training programs and operational procedures throughout the military, providing concrete examples of effective combat medicine and tactical decision-making under pressure. Her techniques for patient transport and triage under fire became part of standard medical training curricula, while her tactical decisions were studied as examples of sound military judgment in complex situations. The convergence of Elena's medical expertise, physical conditioning, and tactical knowledge had created a combination of capabilities that proved decisive during the combat engagement. Her success was not the result of any single exceptional quality, but rather the integration of multiple skills and attributes that had been developed through years of dedicated preparation and professional development. Elena's reflection on the events at combat acknowledged both her individual performance and the collective effort that had made the successful evacuation possible. Lieutenant Kane's tactical leadership, the patrol's suppressive fire, and the coordination with medical evacuation assets had all been essential elements of the operation's success. Her heroism had been individual, but her success had been collaborative. The formal recognition that followed Elena's performance took multiple forms, from official commendations and medal recommendations to informal acknowledgement from peers and superiors who had witnessed her capabilities firsthand. The most meaningful recognition came from the letters she received from the families of the soldiers she had saved, expressing gratitude that no military decoration could adequately represent. Elena's experience at combat became a defining moment not just for her own career, but for the broader question of women's roles in combat operations. Her performance provided empirical evidence that complemented policy arguments, demonstrating That integration based on individual capabilities, rather than categorical assumptions, could enhance rather than compromise military effectiveness. The betting pool that had begun as casual mockery had become a catalyst for fundamental change in attitudes and policies that had seemed immutable just months earlier. The aftermath of the Kanabad engagement marked the beginning of a new phase in Elena's military career, one characterized by recognition rather than skepticism and opportunities rather than obstacles. But more importantly, it marked a transformation in the culture and attitudes of the soldiers who had witnessed her performance, creating ripple effects that would influence military policies and practices for years to come. Elena Vasquez had not just saved 3 lives during those desperate hours in Afghanistan, she had helped save the military from its own limiting beliefs about human potential and capability. 6 weeks after the Kanabad operation, Elena stood in the command briefing room at FOB Crimson, surrounded by officers whose attitudes toward her had undergone a transformation, so complete that it might have seemed impossible just 2 months earlier. The morning briefing covered routine operational matters, but Elena's presence at the senior staff table represented a fundamental shift in how female soldiers were perceived and integrated into combat leadership roles throughout the theater. Colonel Patricia Hendricks had arrived at FOB Crimson 3 days earlier as part of a fact-finding mission commissioned by the Pentagon to evaluate the effectiveness of gender integration in forward combat units. Her investigation had been prompted partly by Elena's performance at Kanabad, but also by a growing body of evidence that traditional assumptions about women's capabilities in combat roles were being contradicted by actual battlefield performance. Across multiple theaters of operation, Elena's promotion to Sergeant First Class had been expedited through channels that normally required months of bureaucratic processing, but her performance record and the recommendations from every officer in her chain of command had eliminated the usual administrative delays. The promotion ceremony had been conducted in the same briefing room where Morrison's betting pool had originally been conceived, a detail that several attendees had noted with varying degrees of irony and satisfaction. Morrison himself had requested a private meeting with Elena following the promotion ceremony, an encounter that proved to be one of the most awkward and meaningful conversations of Elena's military career. His apology had been genuine and comprehensive, acknowledging not just his specific behavior, but the broader pattern of discrimination and prejudice that had characterized the unit's treatment of Elena during her first months at FOB Crimson. "I want you to know that what happened at Kanabad changed how I think about everything," Morrison had said, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort with the conversation's emotional demands. "I was wrong about you, wrong about women in combat, wrong about what actually matters when people's lives are on the line. I've got a daughter back home, and I hope that when she grows up, she'll have the same opportunities you fought for." Elena's response to Morrison's apology had been characteristically direct and focused on moving forward rather than relitigating past grievances. She appreciated his acknowledgement of his mistakes, but her primary concern was ensuring that future female soldiers wouldn't face the same systematic skepticism and hostility that had marked her own experience. Change required both individual recognition of error and institutional reforms that would prevent similar patterns from recurring. The broader implications of Elena's performance had resonated throughout military command structures in ways that surprised even advocates for expanded women's roles in combat operations. General Marcus Thompson, the theater commander, had personally reviewed the after-action reports from Kanabad and incorporated Elena's tactics into training scenarios for special operations medical personnel. Her techniques for patient evacuation under fire had become part of standard curricula at military medical schools. Elena's own reflection on the events at Kanabad had evolved during the weeks that followed, moving from the immediate focus on medical procedures and tactical decisions to a broader understanding of the cultural and institutional changes that her performance had helped catalyze. She had not set out to become a symbol or pioneer, but circumstances had placed her in a position where her individual actions carried implications far beyond their immediate, tactical consequences. The investigation conducted by Colonel Hendricks revealed that Elena's experience at FOB Crimson was representative of broader patterns affecting female soldiers throughout forward deployed units. The systematic skepticism, informal betting pools, and social isolation that Elena had encountered were not unique to her situation but reflected institutional attitudes that were undermining both unit cohesion and operational effectiveness across multiple commands. Elena's participation in Colonel Hendricks' investigation required her to document and discuss experiences that she had previously handled through private endurance and professional focus. The process was emotionally demanding but also cathartic, providing an opportunity to transform personal challenges into institutional improvements that would benefit future female soldiers facing similar circumstances. The recommendations that emerged from Hendricks' investigation included mandatory sensitivity training for all personnel in integrated units, formal mentorship programs for female soldiers in combat specialties, and accountability measures for commanders who failed to address discrimination or harassment within their units. Elena's experiences provided concrete examples that supported each recommendation, making the proposed reforms more credible and compelling than abstract policy arguments. Elena's assignment to the Theater Medical Training Facility represented both recognition of her expertise and an opportunity to influence the preparation of future combat medics regardless of their gender. Her curriculum development work focused on realistic training scenarios that prepared medical personnel for the physical and psychological demands of treating casualties under fire, incorporating lessons learned from her own experience at Khanabad. The training programs that Elena developed emphasized the integration of medical expertise with tactical thinking and physical conditioning, recognizing that effective combat medicine required capabilities that extended far beyond traditional medical training. Her approach challenged conventional assumptions about the separation between medical and combat roles, arguing that battlefield conditions required medics who could function as both healers and fighters when circumstances demanded. Elena's reputation within the medical community extended beyond her military service to influence civilian emergency medicine training programs that sought to incorporate military trauma care techniques into their curricula. Her publications in military medical journals provided detailed analyses of treatment protocols under extreme conditions, contributing to a growing body of literature on combat casualty care that saved lives in both military and civilian contexts. The personal cost of Elena's pioneering role became apparent during quiet moments when the immediate demands of military service allowed space for emotional processing of her experiences. The constant pressure to prove herself, the weight of representing all women in combat roles, and the physical and psychological demands of her duties had created a level of stress that required careful management to prevent burnout or emotional breakdown. Elena's relationship with her family had been complicated by her deployment and the publicity surrounding her performance at Khanabad. Her parents were proud of her achievements, but concerned about the risks she faced and the additional pressures that came with her symbolic status. Her younger sister had decided to pursue a military career, partly inspired by Elena's example, a development that filled Elena with both pride and apprehension about the challenges her sister would face. The media attention that followed Elena's story created opportunities to advocate for policy changes, but also exposed her to criticism from individuals who opposed expanded roles for women in combat operations. Death threats and harassment required security measures that Elena found personally burdensome, but she recognized that public visibility was necessary to maintain momentum for institutional reforms. Elena's speaking engagements at military academies and professional conferences provided platforms to share her experiences and advocate for evidence-based Policies regarding gender integration and combat roles. Her presentations focused on tactical and medical lessons learned rather than gender politics, an approach that proved more effective at changing minds than confrontational advocacy might have achieved. The long-term impact of Elena's performance at Khanabad could be measured in policy changes that expanded opportunities for female soldiers across multiple military specialties. Combat exclusion policies that had seemed permanent just years earlier were modified to allow female soldiers to serve in roles previously restricted to men, with Elena's performance cited as evidence supporting these changes. Elena's mentorship of younger female soldiers became an informal but essential part of her duties, providing guidance and support for women who faced challenges similar to those she had encountered during her own career development. Her advice emphasized preparation, professionalism, and persistence as the most effective responses to skepticism and discrimination. The evolution of Elena's relationship with Lieutenant Kane illustrated the broader changes that her performance had catalyzed within military leadership culture. Kane's initial professional respect had deepened into genuine admiration and friendship, but more importantly, his leadership approach had been fundamentally altered by witnessing Elena's capabilities under extreme pressure. Kane's own career advancement had been enhanced by his association with Elena's success, but he used his increased influence to advocate for policies that would create more opportunities for talented soldiers regardless of their gender or background. His promotion to major included assignment to a staff position where he could influence training programs and personnel policies on a broader scale. Elena's technical innovations in combat medicine extended beyond training programs to include equipment modifications and tactical procedure improvements that were adopted throughout military medical services. Her suggestions for medical kit organization, patient transport techniques, and triage protocols under fire became standard operating procedures that improved survival rates for wounded soldiers across multiple theaters of operation. The academic study of Elena's performance at Khanabad contributed to military science research on leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the integration of diverse personnel in high-stress environments. Her case became a standard example in leadership courses at military academies and staff colleges, illustrating principles that extended beyond gender issues to encompass broader questions about human performance and potential. Elena's transition from active duty to veteran status involved careful consideration of how to continue contributing to military improvements while pursuing civilian career opportunities that built on her unique combination of medical expertise and leadership experience. Her decision to pursue advanced education in trauma surgery was supported by military scholarships that recognized her potential contributions to both military and civilian medicine. The legacy of Elena's performance at Khanabad influenced recruitment policies that emphasized individual capabilities rather than categorical assumptions about gender-based limitations. Military recruiters were trained to identify and develop talent regardless of traditional demographic categories, leading to more diverse and capable units across all military specialties. Elena's story became part of military folklore in the best sense, inspiring soldiers who faced their own challenges with discrimination or skepticism about their capabilities. Her example demonstrated that exceptional performance could overcome institutional barriers, but also highlighted the need for systematic reforms to ensure that individual heroism wasn't required to achieve basic professional respect. The friendship that developed between Elena and the soldiers she had rescued at Khanabad provided ongoing reminders of the human impact of her professional dedication and tactical competence. Sergeant Ahmad's successful recovery and return to duty, Captain Rashid's promotion and assignment to a training command, and Corporal Nasir's complete neurological recovery validated Elena's medical decisions and evacuation procedures in the most meaningful way possible. Elena's influence on military culture extended beyond combat medicine to encompass broader questions about leadership, teamwork, and the importance of judging individuals by their performance rather than their demographic characteristics. Her example challenged assumptions that had limited human potential and organizational effectiveness for generations. The institutional changes that followed. Elena's performance represented progress toward a military culture based on merit rather than prejudice, but Elena remained aware that such changes were fragile and required constant reinforcement to prevent regression to previous patterns of discrimination and exclusion. Her continued advocacy emphasized vigilance and accountability as essential elements of lasting reform. Elena's personal growth through her military experiences included developing a deeper understanding of her own capabilities and limitations, as well as a clearer sense of how individual actions could contribute to broader social and institutional change. Her confidence was earned through performance rather than assumption, creating a foundation for future challenges that was both realistic and optimistic. The ripple effects of Elena's story continued to influence military policies and training programs years after the events at Kanabad, demonstrating that individual acts of courage and competence could have consequences far beyond their immediate tactical impact. Her legacy was measured not just in lives saved or awards received, but in opportunities created for future generations of soldiers who would benefit from expanded definitions of military capability and potential. Elena's final reflection on her military service emphasized gratitude for the opportunities to serve alongside exceptional soldiers who had ultimately judged her by her performance rather than their preconceptions. The betting pool that had once symbolized skepticism about her capabilities had become a reminder that assumptions could be changed through evidence, and that courage sometimes required challenging not just external enemies, but internal prejudices that limited human potential. The transformation of Elena's unit from skepticism to respect represented a microcosm of broader changes that were reshaping military culture in fundamental ways. Her story demonstrated that progress was possible when individuals had the courage to challenge limiting beliefs and institutions, had the wisdom to learn from evidence rather than tradition. Elena Vasquez had entered military service seeking opportunities to serve her country and develop her capabilities in challenging and meaningful ways. Her experience at Kanabad had provided those opportunities in ways she could never have anticipated, transforming her from a competent soldier into a catalyst for institutional change that would benefit countless others who would follow in her footsteps. The lasting impact of Elena's service extended beyond her individual achievements to encompass the broader principle that military effectiveness was maximized when all soldiers were judged by their capabilities rather than their demographics. Her legacy was not just personal but institutional, contributing to a military culture that was both more inclusive and more effective than the one she had originally encountered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.